to our seventh lecture of the course, the Industrial Revolution. This we've already touched on some, because the roots of the Industrial Revolution, of course, can be found in the 1700s with that modernization of agriculture. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we're also concluding in the end of our last chapter, the Napoleonic era. You should be familiar with the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon's defeat. This was the international, it's not actually a Congress. It's more like what we might call today a summit, international summit that took place in Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars. The object of the Congress of Vienna was to create a balance of power, basically to make sure that France didn't dominate the continent of Europe like it had over the previous 10 or 15 years since Napoleon had been in charge, between about 1799 to 1815. He had been the 10,000-pound gorilla on the continent of Europe, if I can use that kind of an expression to show his overwhelming, at least military strength. He created what was known as the Napoleonic system, or the continental system. And he wanted to create a big free trade zone all across Europe. And one thing that I'd like you to point out, to keep in mind, that Europe, in a sense, had never been so united since the time of the Roman Empire under Napoleon. Of course, England and Russia were the primary countries that stood beyond Napoleon's grasp, and in a way, they helped to bring down his downfall as well. So Napoleon built these roads, built up the infrastructure across the continental Europe, across France, Spain, Belgium, across all those German states. And this was a free trade zone. He even built the roads that connected all these places on the same routes and the same Roman roads that had existed, that still were kind of visible and in some ways usable, that had been the leftovers from the Roman Empire thousands of years earlier. But let's move on, though, to this next chapter on the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was driven by the growth of new technologies in industry, specifically the steam engine and James Watt's steam engine, the building of these large textile mills, and a whole new group of social class, or a whole new group known as the working class. These are the people that would work in first the text mills and the coal mines, and later on in all kinds of different factories. So you have the rise of industrialization, and remember, only one part of the economy at this time is being industrialized, primarily the textile industry. And at the same time, you had industrialization going on, and people going to textile factories and textile mills to work, and down in coal mines. You also had the growth of domesticity at this time, and respectability. And this was the idea that there were spaces where women were allowed to be in control, but it was mostly inside the home and the world other than the world of business and the public, what we call the public sphere. Sometimes we call these gendered spaces. Gendered meaning spaces that are defined by which gender, male or female, occupy those spaces. Home is for the woman, according to this gender ideology, this system of beliefs. And men were for more the rough and tumble world of business and working class jobs and coal mines. And the ideal, of course, was, as you're probably familiar in American history, was similar in Europe, to building an ideal household where women didn't have to work. But of course, there's a contradiction in this, because only middle class and upper class households could afford to have women not working. Most working class women, in reality, worked and worked quite a bit. I like this question though that your textbook asks about how did the industrial revolution create new social and political conflicts? Um, because the industrial revolution changes the way people work, the kind of jobs they do, the kind of way that they think of time. Think about people's lives now being dominated not by the rise and fall of the sun and when you can get work done out in the farm fields, but by the factory bell, by the shift. And increasingly, a lot of these mills and coal mines, they're going to work 24 hours. The emphasis in the Industrial Revolution is all about efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. This doesn't always mean thinking about your workers because they want cheap labor. And I want to go through quickly as well why England and the Netherlands were the first to industrialize. First thing you need in an industrial revolution is capital. This means free money to be spent. You know, there's one thing that rich people like. It's not just having a big mountain of cash, but it's taking a mountain of cash and turning it into more mountains of cash, right? Put your money where it's going to make more money. Well, then you don't even have to work, right? That's kind of the goal of capitalism is to take capital, take your profits from one business and put them in more profit-making schemes, profit-making businesses. So England had a lot of these, kind of an entrepreneurial culture. That's the number one reason. Private capital and an entrepreneurial culture. They also had a lot of cheap raw materials coming in from places like the United States, and a lot of these textile mills. Remember, they're producing cloth, and what is their raw material? Their raw material is cotton. And why is it so cheap? Because it's made with industrial-like efficiency, but not on really what we would think of as industrial farms, but on southern plantations in the United States and in the Caribbean and South America as well, where slavery still existed at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So keep that in mind as well. Workers are suffering perhaps in these factories and textile mills, and so are children who are working in these factories, which I'll talk about in a minute. But also in the whole chain of supply chain of materials that are coming to these factories across the ocean, and sometimes even along the one side of that triangular trade of commerce that went around the Atlantic Ocean, where the slaves who were, in effect picking the cotton and putting it on the ships that then would be bound for the textile mills. So keep that in mind as well. Also, for the Industrial Revolution to occur, you had to have free labor where those textile mills were. In England, you had an agricultural revolution, which we had talked about very at the beginning of the semester. We talked about the introduction of these new crops and plant rotations to keep your fields as fertile and productive as possible. But also, as farms became more and more efficient and more run like businesses, they didn't need as many agricultural workers. So lots of people sitting around, especially in the wintertime, with nothing to do. And if you have really high unemployment, for example, you also can hire people for really cheap because people are going to work for anything to put money in their pockets so they can, in turn, put food on their table. The other thing that England, as well as the Netherlands, had, the other country that industrializes first, are lots of coal mines, natural resources. And a lot of these factories, textile mills that I point out to students that were transformed into steam-run factories were started actually as factories that used the power of streams and rivers underneath them. They literally had a mill wheel powered by rushing water in the basement. They took those same factories. I visited one of these factories a number of years ago in England outside of Manchester, and in the factory basements are actually rivers running through them with a wheel turning the looms. They just simply put in a new loom in the basement that was powered then by James Watt's steam engine. So little changing of the hardware there, and boom, you have an industrial revolution powered by steam. No more relying on the gravity, the force of gravity pulling water down the mountainside. Now you just boil a lot of water and you capture the energy from that boiling water in the steam engine that turns the loom, that weaves all kinds of cloth. Look at the map in your textbook showing the spread of industrialization in 1850. You see by 1850, keep in mind the revolution begins, economic revolution begins as early as about the 1770s and really gets rolling after the Napoleonic Wars, after 1815, and starts spreading to other countries. One of the things that garnered a lot of attention, though, during the Industrial Revolution was the use of child labor in these new factories. Remember, there's no regulations whatsoever. And so children are used, often placed in some of the most dangerous jobs, famously crawling into the looms with their little hands poking into places where these gears and that sometimes were even turning at the time when they're trying to repair them, with tragic results, of course, sometimes for some of these children. Women were being used as well in the mills and in the coal mines, even because they could be paid less than men. This prompted some of the first reform movements in the new century, in the 19th century. In fact, in Great Britain, government workers, for the first time, really, we have a kind of government investigations of social conditions. Those sorts of things had never happened before. These government paid writers and statistic collectors show up at these textile mills and began paying attention and taking notes on what's happening there and how things are being produced and how workers are being treated. And there's all these horror stories of women working underground in the coal mines under the most wretched of conditions. And really a lot of sympathy goes out towards the children working in the mills and mines. And it creates really a new category and a way of thinking about children too, as they begin sentimentalizing. Remember, this is a time of romanticism, and they begin feeling in their heart that children really should be protected. And you might ask, well, haven't children always wanted to be protected by their mothers or by their parents? And yes, that's true in a certain sense. But there was also often the expectation that as soon as a child began to be starting to be physically mature enough, physically and emotionally, to take orders and do work, then they should be out there working. Well, now there begins, just like there was this cult of domesticity around the home that people are writing increasingly about in newspapers and magazines and things like that. So too, there's this new sense that children should be protected maybe up until their age at least 14 or 15. They shouldn't be sent into these dangerous jobs. They shouldn't be working. They should have a little kind of time before life begins, where really they should be educated and trained. So industrialization did cause a certain amount of new social problems that then government in some ways begins to try and react against and try to solve some of those problems. You see this in England with the Factory Act that's passed in the 1830s, and the other contradiction that I want to point out about industrialization was that reliance of the textile mills on the raw materials coming from slave labor in the Americas and in the southern states of the United States in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And the British Parliament in 1833 will ban slavery, will abolish slavery across the British Empire. But at the same time, the contradiction here is that the slave trade continues nonetheless. And really, right up into the 1850s, it doesn't seem to go down much. The numbers of people even being enslaved still in Africa and sent to the New World. That doesn't really end until the 1850s, and we even have evidence that it continued right up until the beginning of the American Civil War. And then there were women who increasingly began to get organized into moral crusades of the era. This again was seen as a respectable thing for middle-class women who ideally shouldn't be working out there outside of the home, but if they wanted to do any work, the acceptable way at the time, they thought, was for women to get involved in charity work. Women were thought to have, in a sense, a higher moral calling than men, though they were to be protected. So women began getting involved in campaigns for temperance and against alcohol. Temperance is the movement to get people to drink responsibly, I guess we would call it today. They were involved in movements for abolition as well during this time, and they even involved themselves in anti-prostitution movements, because prostitution in these new industrial cities, which perhaps I should emphasize more, what horrified a lot of people were the new conditions in these industrial cities that sprang up around the textile mills, around the coal mines. And all this, too, then begins to be written about by the 1820s, 30s, and 40s in daily newspapers. And a widening group, a broadening group of people are literate and now and are reading and sometimes even seeing pictures in lithographs in books, in newspapers. They're reading serialized novels in newspapers, such as those written by Charles Dickens, which often help to reinforce both the morality of the time, of the cult of sort of domesticity, as I called it, and the sentimentalizing of childhood and children, and the rise of the novel as a popular form of entertainment, which we've talked a lot about in this class with Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, especially in the last chapter. One of the things I want to begin drawing together here as I conclude this lecture is too that this era becomes known as an era of isms, of another word invented at this time, or invented during the French Revolution, of an era of ideologies, a system of belief, a way of looking at the world grounded in your beliefs. And these were seen in these new movements, one of which we've already talked quite a bit about, Romanticism. I'm really glad the way it worked out this semester, and we were able to look at Romanticism in the last chapter and really think about it heavily with the reading of Mary Shelley. Now you have the background of Romanticism. It's in many ways a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. They romanticize nature. They romanticize a kind of idyllic past before the Industrial Revolution. That doesn't know the histories, the sense of history that they have isn't very accurate, because they see everything before the Industrial Revolution as kind of being better, and oftentimes sentimentalize the quaint little English village where everyone is healthy and above average, and the English village in early modern times and medieval times never really lived up to that ideal. Of course, they weren't perfect places to live, but nonetheless, romantics like to reflect upon those earlier pre-industrial times in English and European history, because of the nightmare that some of them saw of industrialization, the monster of industrialization, if you will. So keep that in mind as well. One of the other isms, of course, at this time is socialism, another reaction against industrialization, a response to it. Socialists often emphasize cooperation rather than competition. They lamented, they really were upset, in other words, about the fact that society was increasingly transformed into what Karl Marx would call the proletariat, or the working class, and the bourgeoisie, or the factory-owning wealthier class. The bourgeoisie was the new word, French word, obviously, that comes from the French Revolution, popularized by the French Revolution. It means a little bit like the modern term bougie that many of you are probably familiar with today. But it also referred to those people who were the investors in society and investing in all the new ways of making money. And you also have figures like the factory owner Robert Owen and his new model factory in Lanark, Scotland, which tried to treat the workers in a more humane way and give them a role in the way in which the factory or the textile mill was run. There was education for the children, almost like daycare. It was pretty nice. It seemed to work fairly well, although when Owen himself leaves and comes to the United States to establish and to found a socialist community here in Indiana, it doesn't go so well and becomes corrupted. And you can read about Owen and Owenism in your textbook and in various sources on the internet. The other ism that I want to talk to you about, that I want to mention, is nationalism. And again, the previous chapter gave you a great heads up on the way in which the French Revolution created this new sense of nationalism that was formed all around these revolutionary symbols, such as the tricolor flag, the Liberty hat, Napoleon's way of harnessing French revolutionary slogans and turning them into his own, right, and making himself emperor. Nationalism is simply that the state represents the ethnicity and the language of the people underneath it. The contradiction here that your textbook talks about is, of course, that colonialism is still going on at this time. And are we going to define a state by its ethnicity or by its language? Well, a lot of states are actually multilingual, especially colonial states and especially empires. So one of the last things that's discussed in this chapter are the revolutions of 1848. Now, I'm going to give one last lecture in the class when we conclude on the revolutions of 1848. They're included in this chapter, but I think they're so important that they deserve a little extra time. You can read about what were known as the Hungry Forties. This was across much of the world at this time, but particularly in Europe. A lot of the potato harvests, especially in Ireland, failed at that time, and revolutions broke out once again. And the socialists really believed, Karl Marx really believed, that the world was teetering on the verge of revolution and that the capitalist system might soon be swept away altogether. Obviously, that doesn't happen. And actually, the age of revolutions ends with the revolutions of 1848. And a new consensus in the Victorian age comes out of the revolutions of 1848, liberal constitutions and some reforms, but I'll talk about that in my final and concluding lecture for the course. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you found it helpful. Please write down some of those terms, or all of those terms that I mentioned. They're almost all mentioned in your textbook as well. I look forward to our discussion this week. Talk soon.